All right, well, hi everybody, and welcome to the conversation. I'm here with a friend of mine, Calvin Culverwell, and Calvin, where are you coming from today, man?
Dude, I'm in Auckland, New Zealand.
Auckland, New Zealand. So, dude, thanks again for doing this, man. This is really just a joy to chat with you.
Yeah, man, it's a real treat as well. So thank you for involving me.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and it's fun with technology, dude. We can be talking halfway around the world, and it doesn't feel like we are, I guess, necessarily. So, now, Calvin, obviously, most people that may be listening won't know your background. So, why don't you just tell us a little bit about where you come from, how you grew up, and maybe a little bit about what you're doing now?
Yeah, man, for sure. I was born in the '80s in South Africa, so I'm originally from there, and so my earliest childhood memories are of apartheid South Africa. So my first classroom experiences were segregated classrooms,
Hmm.
which was a bizarre experience for me as a child because
Yeah.
you kind of want to play with everyone. In the early '90s, maybe like '92, my family decided that South Africa was becoming pretty unsafe, and we immigrated to what was probably the easiest country to immigrate to at the time, which was New Zealand,
Okay.
and and just kind of settled in and have always our family's always loved like the New Zealand lifestyle um, and yeah, so basically growing up here since I was like 5 or 6 years old. Um, didn't grow up in any sort of Christian family. Like we had an incredible family. My parents were wonderfully supportive and loving,
Yeah.
and I had a real wonderful childhood. But we didn't have any sort of outworked faith.
Okay.
And then when I was 17, our entire world kind of was turned on its head when my dad was diagnosed with brain cancer,
Wow.
and that really was like the first sort of tectonic shift in sort of how we as a family unit and as individuals thought about life.
Okay.
And so what was really incredible is I've got this very, very vivid memory of my parents sort of coming to terms with my dad's diagnosis, and their response was like, "Well, we need God." So that was like
Wow.
their response. So the next week, my mum and my dad were in church, um, and so my process was a little bit different. I was 17 years old. I had a bunch of friends at high school who, you know, God bless them. Like their best way of dealing with that was like, man, let's take Calvin out for a couple parties and put a couple beers in his hand, and like
Yeah.
like I just think in a way it's like sort of really beautiful that your friends just want to help
Yeah.
you have a good time in some way.
Yeah. They were trying to help you
That's
cope in the way they knew.
Yeah,
Yeah.
totally. Just trying to help you get through. But the turning point for me was I was invited by a friend at school. He asked me to go and play some music with him and some friends. And so he was like, we're starting this like sort of pop punk band. We would love you to come and jam with us. And so ended up going around to his friend's house. Met these two guys who were the sons of the senior pastor of the Vineyard Church that I've been a part of. And so that was really the start for me. So, I was playing punk music with these dudes, and just sort of had this memory of one day being invited to stick around for like a small group meeting at their house.
Hmm.
And this for me was really the most pivotal moment. Was for the first time I saw people, probably like 10 teenagers standing in a circle singing some worship songs. And I remember like the first two songs, it was just it was really weird.
I bet.
People worshiping is really strange.
Yeah. So,
you know
what was that like not coming from a church experience? Because you're used to music, but now worship music's a different thing. So, what was that like just watching it for the first time?
Yeah, it was I mean it was just so directed towards something, and so I honestly remember having this sort of shift where uh, sort of somewhere between song 2 and 3, this realization dawned on me that like, oh, like I think these people have something that I want.
Wow.
So I just really clear. I just loved the way the energy was directed
Yeah.
towards God. Like that's kind of what it was. And so my conversion experience, if you will, it never came from it was never like a big message from the front. It was never an altar call. it was never me trying to like negotiate my way into like an eternal life after I died.
Right.
I wasn't concerned about stepping out on the road and a bus hitting me and worrying about whether I was going upstairs or downstairs. Literally, like my only sort of movement and desire came from this like thing of going, oh, I think I want what these people have. Like,
right,
it was just this like deep peace. So I just wanted to enter into that. And that was it, man. I asked them to pray for me at the end, and so then people laid hands on me, and that was a strange experience.
Yeah.
But it was profoundly loving, and it was profoundly peaceful, and I don't know. It met me in a very intimate, and a very personal, and a very powerful way, and so that was the start of like my relationship with Christ.
Wow. So from that point on, Calvin, like having that experience, what did that shift for you? So as far as the trajectory of your life, what kind of began to happen to you from that point forward?
I think it just changed the way I sought success in my life. Like, you know, when I was young, I was really, really probably driven by money. Like in my mind, I was always going to end up in business, and you know, like, you know, I remember having this conversation with a teacher at school one day, and I was basically like, I'm going to be a millionaire by the time I'm 28. Like that was my goal, you know. I'm like, and I was quite sort of like, you know, I was real headstrong about like, you know, I had this very particular direction, and suddenly I found myself in this space where I was like playing music with my friends. I had this very safe environment to go to that was sort of outside the stuff that was going on with my family. And I just sort of got into the church thing. So I loved showing up for church. I loved so much the energy of worship, and I just was a bit of a sponge, you know. So I just started soaking up everything, and I remember very quickly, maybe within the first 6 months, being like, oh, I think if I'm skilled at anything, I think I might be made to do some sort of ministry, you know. So I very distinctly remember, I don't think I necessarily felt called to be a pastor, but I very distinctly remember feeling the call to ministry, and to you know, finding ways of like loving people and inspiring people and engaging people with this God that I'd come to know. Yeah. So that for me was the pull. So that really started to affect things. I'd already started studying business at university at that point. And so, those first 2 years were really interesting because it was like I could feel the pull towards the ministry thing. Yeah. I was still I was studying business at university, and then at the same time, my dad was still getting, you know, he had 2 brain surgeries at that point, and he was starting to deteriorate. And you know, he very quickly, you know, and I think it was 2006, he went downhill real fast, and you know, he ended up passing away in that December, and that was really interesting for me because it was like by that time I was very embedded in church culture. I was really about it, and you know, God had been a really like safe pair of hands for me. Like my relationship with God was in a really good spot, but I was really struggling to like figure myself out socially and relationally with the people around me, and in the wake of my dad passing, there was I felt like a lot of pressure to be this like very together person, and everyone I met would be like, oh man, like you're doing so well, you're kind of holding it together, and I just had like no way of really processing my grief.
I'm sure.
And so you know, a year and a half of that, of just like sort of suppressing my grief and like trying to do everything, I got to this point where I kind of snapped a little bit and ended up disappearing. Like, not that I lost my faith or anything, but I just disappeared. I disappeared off overseas. Funnily enough, that was like probably right around the time I met you. So that would have been like, you know, early 2008 maybe. Yeah. And yeah, just was like, just had to unplug out of New Zealand, out of all my relational networks. I just kind of couldn't do it anymore. Yeah. And so I had about a year of I don't know, figuring out myself a little bit.
Right.
I don't know, just being disconnected and just kind of like really enjoying that I was disconnected.
I bet, yeah.
And then I had like these 2 really potent moments with God, which really was like, okay, cool, I need to go home and I need to get myself on track. And I, you know, within a sort of year or 2 of coming home, I was you know, employed by the church as our youth pastor. I'd sort of settled on pastoral ministry as a way of pushing forward, and started my study with St. Stephen's University, started my master's in ministry through them, and just began this process of like really investing myself in church ministry. And it was wonderful, like I loved it. And so I worked as a pastor for 10 years for a Vineyard church, the same Vineyard church that I became a Christian in.
Yeah.
And during that time sort of, fell both in love and out of love with Vineyard theology at times. And sort of just got to navigate, just navigate all of that through 10 years of ministry. And then, the interesting thing for me is over, I've always had this thing of like, I feel called to ministry, but not necessarily pastoral, being a pastor.
Yeah.
And so, about 2 years ago, I was approached by an organization that supports people in the music industry here. And they said, hey, there's this huge gap of support for musicians. And so we're after someone who would like develop chaplaincy and support systems and put a whole bunch of community stuff around musicians in the industry here. And so for the last 2 years, I've sort of been doing that and just looking at what it means to get alongside people in their vocational pursuit, and people from all different kinds of backgrounds and really like working with them to foster creativity and beauty in the work that they do and to create from a place of health. And anyone who knows anything about the music industry knows that it's an industry that kind of, first of all, it commodifies people's creativity, but it also just chews people up and it spits them out. So, really wanting to make sure that people are really well looked after as they pursue this thing that's like their dream.
Yeah.
And so that's been like incredibly life-giving for me. And that's, it sort of feels like I'm increasingly slotting into my sweet spot of ministry.
Yeah.
So that's a real quick.
Yeah.
I guess quick. Maybe not so much, but
so
a relatively quick way.
With that journey then, Calvin, because I'd love to get back to kind of what you're doing now, kind of where the Spirit's led you into sort of the music industry, with the things that God has given you a heart to do. But obviously one of the reasons I was just knowing you over the years, I was stoked to be able to have an initial conversation. It's because you really have a background and experience with Nothing's Gonna Stop It material and with the radical middle. You and I have had a lot of conversations over the years. So even just in your upbringing and kind of your journey through ministry, where did you first encounter even the phrase the radical middle, and what does that mean to you? I'd love to unpack kind of your thoughts with radical middle and the theology of kind of what you've experienced over time.
Yeah, for sure. So I first read probably like in the first or second year of being a Christian, someone gave me Quest for the Radical Middle.
Okay.
Which was Bill's book, and I just I loved the idea of tension. And I loved the idea that you could have like a little bit of everything. Like that was what was mostly drawn to me. I've always struggled with the concept of like black and white, like things being super clear.
Okay.
And have just it's interesting for me, like coming into the Christian tradition, I never had to deconstruct anything, right? I just had to construct. So I didn't have any sort of like Christian worldview that I had to unpack. I sort of knew the stories of Jesus, but I'd always just kind of admired Jesus as a person,
right,
or a rabbi or something. So I never had anything to like break apart, and so I was really drawn to the nature of the theology of the radical middle. That it was this idea of like, we want to draw on the best of both, like all of these experiences, or
right,
and how do we hold these things in tension really well? How do we hold them in tension graciously, with humility, and with a pursuit of beauty? So I was really drawn to that, like as a brand new Christian. I love the idea that things didn't have to be like, if you're a Christian, this is the box you fit in, and this is what it looks like to be a Christian. I just loved off the bat that it was like Vineyard was like quirky musicians, who wore like floral shirts and were pretty chill about stuff. And like, Vineyard itself kind of like just destroyed my notion of what church was. And really gave me the freedom and permission to kind of explore a little bit. As I got a bit older and as I started studying, particularly, I was really fortunate that Jack Scott was one of my professors at university.
Yeah.
And so he used Nothing's Gonna Stop It as like the basis of like one of his papers. And what I was like so drawn to was the way that the story, the meta narrative of Scripture seemed to like emanate out of him. Like he just carried it,
Yeah.
And so I was like this like really vivid memory of like the first day of class, him opening Nothing's Gonna Stop It up to page 1. So he opens up on page 1, and then he leans back in his chair, puts his feet up on the table, and for the next week proceeds to not turn a single page, but basically like just follow it verbatim, like
right.
just work his way through it, and it was just like, oh man, like this story is so ingrained in him, and I just loved the way he carried it. So I was really drawn to like Jax as a person, and just loved the way he spoke about the scriptures, about the story, about the histories, about the culture. Like I think he wasn't precious about stuff except that he was precious about the story,
Yeah.
And so,
yeah.
And so I was just so drawn to that, and I think for me, like when I thinking back on the times I've read Quest for the Radical Middle and sort of had conversations with people who are part of that era, like the quest really was that whole thing of just like, it was a John 5:19 thing, right? It was like looking for what God was up to, and like moving and responding to that. And to me, like that just forms like the basis of it. It's like what is God doing here in this cultural moment,
right?
In this in this environment, what is God up to? And I so love that as like an earnest, humble willingness to move towards God is up to. That like that's what kind of draws me to the radical.
Right. So for you, Calvin, because one of the things that obviously our desire is people that are going to interact with us over time, right, is they encounter the storyline material for themselves, right? As people really learn to get immersed in the biblical storyline, whether they go to the website and get the seminar, which we're going to make available, right? Our desire is that people would experience the things that you have in that regard. And so on a practical level, both being in full-time vocational ministry, but even especially now as you're with musicians, right? People that might be far from God, people that might have questions. How has finding your place within the story and being somebody immersed in the larger meta-narrative of what God is doing, how has that impacted on a practical level? Just your experience both in full-time ministry, but then even what you're doing now. Could you unpack how that sort of impacted you along the way?
Yeah, well, I've always thought the story is like an important thing to think of it as something that we wear, that we carry with us.
Yeah.
And that it's not something we just like lump on other people, but we actually help other people discover where they are in the story.
Right.
So, so I guess like the best way for me thinking about it is I really function from like a centered set theology, not a bounded set. So I've never sort of been like, hey, this is, if you're gonna know what I know and believe what I believe and experience what I've experienced, you need to do X, Y, and Z, and then you'll kind of be in. That's kind of bounded set, and I think that's what a lot of Christianity is, and I've really struggled with that. For me, centered set is this idea of like Jesus is at the center. Everyone's on some sort of journey, and all we ever do is look to get alongside them and journey with them. And so that's what I do each and every day. It's like I'm alongside people, and I get to enter into their story. They get a chance to enter a little bit into my story, and then in the process of that relationship developing, we get to uncover where they are in God's story together. And so that for me is, practically it looks like a lot of coffee and a lot of listening and and a lot of good food and and a lot of caring deeply, and just that sense of like really just meeting people with where they're at. And what I've discovered is that, like, say for example with musicians, a lot of them, quite beautifully learn how to play in church. Church is a wonderful environment because we give young kids a chance, right? To get up on stage, play worship. They develop a confidence early on. But there's a lot of musicians that learned their craft in the church, but then gapped out because the church wasn't a safe place or an encouraging place for them to foster and develop and cultivate their sense of creativity. And so a lot of them leave the church feeling sort of hurt or damaged or let down or just kind of over it. And so it's just about sometimes trying to encounter where people are. And I find like, for me, like I'm not a great, like, I'll kind of own this. I'm not a great evangelist. Like, I'm not really good at, I've had lunches with guys who are like, mid-conversation, they're like, hold that thought, bro. And they'll jump outside and they'll like tap someone on the shoulder and like hand them a lollipop, and like 30 seconds later, they're praying for that person. And
Yeah.
they're like, and he's like, sorry, I just had to like lead that person to the Lord. I'm like, oh my goodness, like,
No kidding.
that's unbelievable. I'm just terrible at that.
Yeah.
Like, but what I do think what I do well is like what I would call like rehabilitative Christianity. So, long ago I felt like God gave me a heart for like, the sort of the lost sheep, for lack of better words. And
Lost sheep meaning what?
Find myself entering into a space where like it's just like, okay, man, well, let's just like, I think you've actually got some unhealthy ideas of who God is or what God does or what Jesus invites us towards. And so, just begin this really, sometimes it's hard work, it's months work or years work in some cases, but it's looking to reconcile some of the unhealthy or damaging things and build a more whole, hopefully more beautiful, hopefully more loving, more inclusive picture of who Jesus is.
So let me ask,
does that answer your question?
Yeah, that's great. Let me ask you this. So given the fact that you're around, again, people that are far from God every day, right? Obviously you have a heart to be around musicians and those of that sort of artsy community, right? You mentioned that many of them maybe had a background in church, maybe even learned to play their instrument or whatever they do in church, but have since left for whatever reason. So in your conversations with people that you get to have, if you were to sum up, what are some of the things that people left for? Like, what were the reasons that they left the community of believers? And what do you sense that they're longing for? What the more people you talk to, what are people looking for?
I think, that, like, even in a way, that might even be like two quite different ideas. I think a lot of people leave because they feel like they see hypocrisy in the leadership. People often leave because of like they've experienced some kind of abuse, and like maybe that's at the more like extreme end. Other times, I think people leave because they feel like their voice isn't heard. Other times, I think people leave because they feel like there isn't a place for them, like they don't belong. And I think a lot of musicians, a lot of creative people, right? Their way of engaging with the world and thinking about the world's real different. So, and I think creatives, like, they don't, creatives certainly don't like the concept of like, this is what it looks like to live within these parameters.
Right.
And so, they want a bit of freedom to explore and wrestle and navigate. And I think sometimes, particularly if they go into the scriptures is full of like sort of like evocative metaphor and like powerful imagery and like you look at like the sort of the wild emotional swings of David in the Psalms and like, like there's a lot of like there's a lot of like vivid and raw and authentic human experience going on. And so sometimes I think people read that and they encounter that and they resonate with that, but then that's not what's being communicated to them from the front of church. It's very much like, A, B, and C. Living a life that looks like A, B, and C is what leads you towards freedom. And it's like, oh man, for a creative person, freedom doesn't look like that at all.
Right.
So yeah. So
and real quick, back to, would that be then the bounded set that you were talking about earlier? You mentioned bounded versus centered. That idea that somebody from the front is sort of painting the box for them, would those correlate? Is that kind of the bounded set that they're rejecting, or at least that idea?
Big time, I think, and I think it's something we have to be aware of. Like for me, I think even in the vineyard, it's like sometimes we talk about centered set theology, but it's like a pseudo centered set. It's like actually there is still like a sort of blurry line somewhere, and it's like, oh man, actually for a lot of creatives, it's like they don't want any lines there at all. But they do want to be on some kind of journey, and so it's they're just sometimes it feels like the thing that is given to them is unsatisfactory. It feels limited in scope, and so I think then the desire is like, well, I've got to push the boat out. Sometimes the pushing the boat out is like just a really like, I just don't want to do church anymore, but I'm still really engaged. With a community group or whatever. And then sometimes it's really radical. Sometimes it's like, I just want nothing to do with like the Christian church at all. Like I'm completely done with it. It's a load of bollocks. Like, it's just it's another patriarchal system that is set up to control. And it's like, there's probably like a kernel of truth to some of that, but the response is so radical and so extreme that it's just like, I'm just going to go completely over here and do the other thing, and so so I just think you kind of get everything in between. There's all kinds of different responses. Yeah.
So then the more people you talk to that maybe even are searching, maybe even have questions, what are the questions that you notice people are asking? Like as you get to, like you said, sit down and have those coffees, have those talks with people that are far from God, what are people searching for? Even if they don't have the language to articulate, what do you sense their hearts are longing for the more people you get to talk to?
I think, I mean, I think people want, they want a relationship with God. They want to know the love of God, and they understand that as a core concept. What they struggle with is that so much of it, well, their feeling is that so much of their experience of the loving God and the loving church and the loving Jesus doesn't necessarily line up or like feel loving. You know?
Okay.
I think that it's, like it feels like there's some sort of like disconnect. I think people have a better sort of inherent recognition of what God is like, and so the second that they see anything that doesn't line up with that, their inclination is to reject it. And sometimes that rejection is really quiet and simple, and sometimes it's very vocal, and can really hurt people. So I don't know. I think that's it. I think at the core of everyone is a desire for the kingdom. And I think for me, I think we only need to look at the movement towards social justice, right? You look at any advocacy campaign that's kind of happening, and people are, what are people advocating for? People are advocating for equality in some respects. People are advocating for the releasing of people from the borders. People are crying out for justice for the environment in different ways. They're looking at what's happening in the ocean, and people are going, "Well, we've got to look after ocean." These are all, I think, in some ways, like kingdom cries, right? People want a healed planet. They want a healed society. They want people to be in a relationship. So there is this, I think, a real desire in people for the kingdom. But there's also a very real rejection of the king for different things, for different reasons, I guess. So it's about trying to like reconcile some of that and kind of go, well, actually, okay, how do we walk towards the kingdom and also walk towards the king at the same time? So
let me ask you this, Calvin. Like you mentioned, people have a heart for justice, right? Whatever the cause is. And obviously, you being a guy who's been in the scriptures for years, let me ask you this. So when we think about the kingdom and we read Genesis to Revelation, right, God's heart for justice is throughout the entire thing, right? You can't read the scripture. I mean, I guess you can blindly, but it's hard to miss God's heart for justice throughout the entire story. And yet, like you're describing, there seems to be a disconnect between maybe the everyday person's heart for justice and what we're communicating is actually at the heart of God or what somebody's hearing in church. So what do you think the disconnect is there between what people are experiencing within a church realm and the sort of natural heart for justice? What do you think the disconnect is for people? Or maybe the disconnect for the church itself as we aim to communicate the realities of the kingdom to people?
Yeah, well, I think it starts with what people's picture of justice is and what people's picture of the church is. I think it's always really hard because the most obvious things are always tend to be like the loudest things. So I think a lot of people would look at church and they would say, okay, cool, like churches, they don't pay taxes, they've got these massive buildings, they've got pastors on ridiculous salaries, they kind of see a system set up to achieve one thing that isn't really justice. When actually the majority of the global church are small community churches of less than 150 people. Often those churches are like heavily engaged in local community, are incredibly generous, putting on all kinds of events, run food banks, run budgeting programs. Like local churches are like very connected, and even some big churches run they'll run schools and they'll make access to those schools for people really accessible. So there are elements of justice kind of going on, but I think for most people, their sort of gut response is that like actually the church kind of is more about propping itself up as a system, rather than engaging with some of these core ideas. The other thing is that for some people, I don't think they experience their experience of church as one that's justice oriented. So when we talk about like the LGBT community, like their experience of church was not one of like, oh, those people have our best interests at heart, regardless of like what you believe or how you say it. It's like, man, you can try and say something in the nicest way possible, but for you know, the queer person living down the road who's struggling with suicidal ideation, them being told in no uncertain terms that they can't be loved, that's going to be experienced a certain way. So there's a disconnect between their picture of justice and our picture of justice,
right?
In some way, you know, and so, well, the perceived difference. And so sometimes it's just about, I think about trying to draw into relationship. And actually, I think we begin to discover alongside people on the fringes,
right.
A new idea of what justice is, and we get to discover God in a new way.
Right.
I would think.
So let me ask you this.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, I absolutely think so. And I think that's part of unpacking the conversation is even learning, right, some of the questions to be asking. So now that you've spent some time with what you're doing full time now, just with people in the music industry, right, people that are maybe all over the map, people on the fringes, what have you been learning about God along the way, Calvin, as you've been just sort of in hook, line, and sinker in that community? Like, what have you experienced about Jesus in the last couple of years as you're around the lost and the broken every day?
Man, I think the thing I've learned is that Jesus' default position is always hospitality. So, you know, there's always room at the table. You know, that like reading the Beatitudes and learning that the kingdom is with each and every one of those people. That's where the kingdom is. That's where the kingdom is. Sitting at a table with people who are different from you, think different, have different theologies, have, you know, more painful experiences of church, have more painful experiences of life. Sitting with them, that's where you discover the kingdom. So the best conversations I have with people about life and theology and faith are not people in church, you know. And in fact, so many of the conversations people will come up to me and they'll want to engage in, you know, they'll want to engage in conversations around, let's talk about gay people, you know. It's like, well, there's 7 verses in the Bible that talk about that.
Right.
You know, and it's obviously wrong. And then they just want to cut the conversation there. But it's like, man, I'm in a relationship with these people every day, and they're beautiful people. They're special people. They are my friends. And how they experience life is really important to me.
Yeah.
And how they experience and encounter Jesus is really important to me. So you know, so it's the way you have conversations is just entirely different. But honestly, man, for me, it's in those conversations, I'm discovering the kingdom's there, and it always happens over food, and it always happens when you have the time to just sit and become friends with someone.
Yeah. So what do you think for the average person sitting in church, what do you think keeps us, and maybe your time in vocational ministry kind of helped give you some lens here, but what do you think keeps us from having those conversations and those friendships like you're describing, right? Because you're really discovering something about the kingdom from spending time from people that might be far from Jesus. So what do you think, maybe for those of us in church that have a longing for that, like we might hear your story and think, man, I want to have those conversations like Calvin's talking about. I want to be able to engage with people. What are the obstacles that keep us from those conversations in your experience?
Well, I think to be honest, time is the first one that comes to mind. I think people are pretty time scarce, you know, everyone's so busy, and, you know, particularly in church life, you know, we kind of promote, you know, well, make sure you're at church on Sunday, and then make sure you're doing this thing on Wednesday night, and then there's worship practice on Thursday night, and then, you know, there's this and so we kind of keep, I think the church tends to be pretty insular. And so that does a couple of things. First of all, it just keeps us in the bubble, but then it also keeps us in a constant cycle of affirmation. So we're just always surrounded by people who are saying the same things, doing the same things, believing the same things. Yeah. So we don't get to have any sort of meaningful conversations and actually sit down with someone and go, well, what's your experience, you know? So to meet with, you know, to find a way of kind of going, okay, well, part of our week, we actually want to invite the sort of foreigners who live in our street over for dinner. We want to, you know, just finding spaces where you kind of can connect with it. I don't know, whether it's sports or something, like if you're playing social sports, meeting with people and you're inviting them out for a drink afterwards. I mean, it's actually way simpler than what you think, but I think it starts with hospitality. And I think for me, when I look at the scriptures, Jesus' primary way of engaging with people that are not Pharisees, right? all of his theological conversations is with Pharisees, it's with religious leaders,
Right.
it's engaging in a particular sort of spiritual context.
Right.
But with everyone else, Jesus' mode of operation is hospitality. Like that's his MO. So so it's like, man, if you really want to know how like God feels about that person over there in that corner, or that person of color over there, or that person who works across the office from you.
Right.
Well, it's like that way of knowing is kind of doing hospitality with them. And so if we're willing to carve out time, I think we will discover God moving in a different way to maybe what we see before. That's just my opinion, my experience. Yeah.
So let me ask you this then, like for the people that you're with every day. So you kind of mentioned, right, like in church, we can program each other to death, right? If we've got 7 events during the week, there's literally no bandwidth to be with people that don't know Jesus. So in your experience over the years, what's it been like for you to even kind of shift your priorities, right? To learn to spend time with people? How has that process been for you over time? Because part of what I'm hoping is that as people listen to these conversations, not that there's going to be easy answers, but even the fact that we might just even spark the idea that maybe my priorities need to shift a little bit, right? Maybe there's ways I can begin to reorient my life and actually prioritize time being with people that don't know Jesus. So can you unpack a little bit of what that process has been like for you over the years?
Yeah, well, I think for me, the most interesting thing that happened in our church was I stopped planning community groups and events. I literally like turned around one sermon after years of sort of talking about the importance of community, which I am like I'm about like we need to be with fellow believers. We need to worship together. We need I'm so for it. But I just like, man, I was, working away to try and get people to stuff. And I was like, man, actually, if community is happening, I shouldn't need to plan it, Community is something that should just happen organically. And so I said, look, I'm not going to plan it. If you guys want to do a Bible study, or if you want to have people around in your homes, you guys just do it. But this is what it's going to be like for me. So that was like the first thing at like a ministry level. Is like, okay, well, I'm not going to organize those things. I'm just going to like teach on a Sunday, in our Sunday context, the value of those things. Right. And I'm going to set up a Facebook Messenger group. So instantly, like, people were using that to set up board games nights and pool parties and Bible studies, and it was awesome. It was up and running within a couple of months. The second thing for my wife and I, like we changed our approach to doing like midweek church stuff. So we didn't want to be a part of like a formal church group.
Right.
What we did was we approached like 2 or 3 other couples, and we said, hey, we really like look up to you, and we really love doing life with you. We would like to really intentionally get together with you. So every second week we get together in each other's homes. Our only sort of like mandated thing that we do in that is we take communion. So we break bread and we crack a bottle of wine. Okay. And we open with a prayer, and then like the conversation goes where it needs to go. Sometimes it's a Bible study together. Sometimes it's conversations about what's happening with work. But that intentional investment in life with a few key people, it's really a place of like sort of confession and authenticity and beauty. That for us has been incredibly life-giving. But then outside of that, it liberates us to invest in all kinds of other relationships. So then it's just like, we want to be generous with our home. So we try as much as possible to make ourselves available to have people around, and to try and have different people around and stuff as well. So that's sort of personally what we ended up doing. And then it was just like, okay, cool. Well, let's be really open with our invitations.
Yeah.
So let's go and meet these people for a drink. So it's like, we're really quick to like extend an invitation where we can.
So for you and your wife, as you began to step into that journey, right, like you said, sort of reprioritizing your time, shifting from more organized events, if you will, down to that really intentional group of a few couples. As you began to do that, what did you begin to see about Jesus and sort of his kingdom breaking in? What was that transformation like for you two as you began to engage in those different areas?
Yeah, I mean, I think... it's almost too simplistic to say it's like just those things, but it's a series of things, a series of how like we've been praying together over the years. It's a series of the things we value, of the friends we've been slowly developing. But for me, I think the biggest thing I've seen happen in the last like 4 or 5 years is, and it's both theological as well as relational, and that is that I'm just starting to recognize the kingdom in the most simple, beautiful ways. So for me, like, like we've all been in sort of church experiences where it's like we feel the Holy Spirit, and it's this very like sort of tangible, powerful, intimate, beautiful thing, we've had those experiences.
Right.
But I now have the same response when I'm getting to know someone. I'm learning to recognize a simple conversation as being a divine moment, when Jesus said, like, where 2 or 3 are gathered, like there I am. It's like, oh man, how often do we actually like recognize that? For me is just learning to recognize Christ. Like we think we have this, man, and now we're going into like sort of some different theological and sort of worldview stuff, but we tend to have this idea of like the kingdom of God. Our sort of default is that the kingdom of God is this far away thing. And if we pray enough, or we do enough, or we say enough, or whatever, we can kind of like punch through into that reality and maybe get a little taste of it, and that it's this thing that's up there that we can sometimes maybe experience down here.
Right.
And it's like, actually, no, I think when Jesus says the kingdom of God is at hand, that's coming from a worldview that's not Platonic, that's not sort of, real and spiritual, but a worldview that is like real and spiritual.
Yeah.
It's both and so I think just that simple thing of like practicing the hospitality of Christ, being more open to and more aware of the other, suddenly you're like, for me, I'm starting to like just recognize Jesus. And so I just find that to be incredibly peaceful and beautiful and powerful. And it's the thing I desire more than anything else. So it's like I don't, yeah.
So let me ask you this, kind of bringing all that together, kind of knowing your background and sort of even what you're describing now. So maybe one final question, but it may be sort of unpacking multiple layers of it. With your experience over the years of even being in the scripture, and like you mentioned early on in the conversation, right, getting caught up in the meta narrative, right, sort of the discovering the reality that all the disconnected stories in scripture are really all part of one narrative, right? Why would you say to encourage people as they're engaging in the word, or maybe even desiring to be engaged more in the word, how would you encourage people why it matters, finding yourself caught up on the storyline and knowing the storyline? Why does that matter in just sort of the practical lives we live out? In other words, we can go to church and know all the disconnected Bible stories. This is about David and Goliath, right? This is about Jonah. But why over the years has it mattered for you that you've caught the vision that there's a larger story and that you're a part of it? Like, why would that matter for people?
Well, I think without understanding the meta narrative, you only know part of the picture, right? Like, try and imagine a movie poster where you only see the release date, You don't know what movie you're going to go see. You don't have any sort of vibe of what it's going to be about. Is it going to be The Rock blowing something up, or is it going to be, I don't know, like Jared Leto looking sexy as something? I don't know. Like, if you just get a snapshot of of the release date, like that's one thing.
Right.
That's one element. It's like we have to do everything we possibly can to get the fullest picture possible. And the theological pursuit of the radical middle, or the theological pursuit of the kingdom of God is this process of working as best we possibly can to zoom out on a jigsaw puzzle that we've really only got like some of the puzzle pieces to.
Yeah.
And it's really important to understand that the puzzle pieces we've got, the scriptures, while they're very full, that's also only one element. We've still got to talk about the culture of the time and how culture shifted over these years. We've got to talk about historical context. We've got to talk about the sort of position we read these things from, and recognizing ourselves in different parts of the scriptures. It's like we as Westerners tend to read these stories, and we find ourselves resonating with these people who are actually an oppressed people. We actually read the scriptures as oppressors, and so it's a bizarre thing so much that we resonate with like the oppressed. Oh yeah, I just so know, that story really speaks to me. No, it doesn't. It probably speaks to the person down the road whose family for generations has been living in the same sort of social class, and just struggled to get out because they're working 2 or 3 jobs on minimum wage, and and despite their best efforts, they just can't crack out of that social class. You know, like
Right.
it's like maybe to them the story bears resonance, but man, like let's just be sort of as honest as possible about just recognizing where we are and the incredible privilege we have, you know, the money we have, the opportunities we're afforded, like,
Right.
you know, those kinds of things I'm not lost on. So we have to be able to zoom out, you know, and any good, and sort of stick with that sort of poster idea as a metaphor, like
Right.
any graphic designer worth their salt, like, so anyone who's listening who does graphic design, what are you doing constantly? You're zooming in and out all the time. So we need to zoom in. We need to look at like little verses and parables and stories. Right. Those are good. We can get something meaty out of that. We can get something really beneficial. We can sort of apply it to our lives. You know, right. That's a really good and beautiful thing to do. But we also have to zoom out and work towards getting the fuller picture. It's got to be a bit of both.
Yeah. So again, unpack that a little bit more, if you will. Why is it so important that we zoom out and get that fuller picture? Like, as you think back over your years, and I know I'm kind of harping on this, but I know there's multiple layers. Why is that zooming out had been so important just for you in your own journey?
Well, I think it informs, like, what we know informs our actions, right? What we know informs how we move towards the other, how we pursue God. So if you're only reading the Bible, and like, you know, this is a sort of maybe a crass generalization,
right?
But if you're only reading stories in the Bible that talk about where God sort of talks about blessing you, right. And you're looking for how God is blessing and moving in my life, not that those things are like necessarily wrong, but how could you ever learn to recognize oppression? How could you ever learn to note when someone is in trouble? If you don't look at how things have evolved, even in the scriptures, how attitudes towards slaves shifted from the Old Testament through to the New Testament, and then you also don't look at the shift socially since then. Like, you know, slaves were still a thing 2,000 years ago, but no sort of Christian really sort of would be like, yeah, slavery's okay now. Like, you know, it's in light of the biggest story that we can see God is shifting us towards something, towards a more beautiful reality, a more inclusive reality. You have to know the story, not just to see and understand where things have been, but in order to know where it's going, to be able to recognize it. The Bible, I think, is it's like a lens that to the reality of the kingdom. It's a window that we look through,
right?
And you know, we can press our face up against it to look at this reality, but it still only gives us like sort of 180 degrees of perspective.
Right.
And so the more we know the story, the more we're invested in it, the more appropriately we are able to apply that lens to different situations. And I think for me, what I've found is that it moves me towards, you know, maybe something that is like, you know, more restorative, more inclusive, more gracious, you know, more Christ-like, you know, like, so for me, like, without knowing the story, our actions can never really be like truly informed.
Right. So let me ask you this, Calvin, as your sort of final thought, as we've got people listening, maybe people that are in full-time ministry, maybe people like you that are just working jobs around people every day that are maybe far from God, and they're even wondering for themselves how they can learn to play their part in the larger story. Maybe one final thought from you. How would you encourage people as they're walking out their journeys just like you are? If there was sort of one encouragement or one charge, what would you say to people as they're learning to engage in God's larger story?
I think my big encouragement to people would be like, it's just okay to not be like awesome at this stuff. You know, like, I think it's like we are all learning, we are all growing, and so I think if there is an earnest desire to pursue the kingdom, it's like just live out of that. You know, I think for me, trying to understand humility and just like try and press into humility. So being okay that I don't know it all, being okay that I don't have it all figured out. When people ask me a question about God, like sometimes it's okay to respond with like, oh, I actually don't know. I haven't thought about that.
Yeah.
Or, oh man, that's like a really challenging thing. I think it's okay to be a little bit unsure. Like, you know, maybe what I'm saying is like, it's okay to have a bit of grace for ourselves in this process.
Yeah, that's
and
good.
To just be okay, and just to be okay, like practicing this, you know, like, and relationships are hard work, and I'm not all out extrovert, but but I'm pretty extroverted. Some people are very introverted. It's pretty hard to listen to a podcast and be like, well, man, I struggle to like drum up enough energy to go have dinner with my in-laws every second Wednesday. Like,
yeah, no
let alone,
kidding.
like invite someone from down the street. You know, it's like, oh man, I got total grace for that. Like,
Right.
I'm not saying that that's what you have to do, but I would encourage you. It's like, man, where possible, be open to other people's stories. And if someone's telling you that they've been hurt by the church, don't get defensive. Like, it's, you know, the church is still this human thing, and God's grace very much needs to function within that as well. And so it's like when someone tells you a story that sounds painful or makes you kind of agitated, it's like, just let it be. Just let the person tell their story, and then just get to know them.
Yeah.
So I don't know. That's probably a couple of different.
No, that's awesome.
If that's helpful. Yeah.
It's great, man. But no, Calvin, dude, I really appreciate you taking the time, man. This has been awesome just to chat with you. So.
Thank you, man. Yeah.
Blessings on you, man. Thank you so much. So anyway, man, I'm sure we'll do it again. So appreciate the time, bro.
I hope so.
It's good,
Cheers,
man.
bro.
All right, well, everybody, until the next conversation, grace and peace.